For 30 years, this case remained sealed in the basement archives of the Weber County Sheriff's Department, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence and what investigators would later describe as deliberate institutional amnesia. The manila folder marked Case 54-0312-MULT contained photographs that made seasoned detectives physically ill, witness statements that read like fever dreams, and evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of Utah's political and religious establishment. When retired Detective Harold Brennan finally broke his silence in 1984, 3 decades after the events that would forever scar the small farming community of Millfield, Utah, he spoke of a case that authorities had worked tirelessly to erase from public memory. The documents that recently surfaced through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by investigative journalist Sarah Chen paint a picture of systematic cover-up orchestrated by powerful families whose names still grace buildings and streets throughout the Wasatch Valley. What happened between March 12 and March 15, 1954, in the remote compound known as the Hollister Covenant represents one of the most disturbing mass casualty events in Utah's history, yet it remains virtually unknown outside the tight-knit circles of law enforcement and legal professionals who were sworn to secrecy. The story begins not with violence, but with faith. Ezekiel Hollister, a charismatic former seminary student from Brigham Young University, had established his religious commune in the isolated foothills of Weber County in 1948, purchasing 640 acres of scrubland with money inherited from his grandfather's mining fortune. To the outside world, the Hollister Covenant appeared to be nothing more than another of the many small religious communities that dotted the Utah landscape in the post-war era. Families seeking spiritual fulfillment and escape from the rapid modernization of American society found solace in Hollister's teachings about returning to biblical simplicity and divine revelation. What the outside world didn't know was that by the winter of 1954, something had gone terribly wrong within the compound's wooden walls. The 12 individuals who lost their lives during those 3 days in March had not fallen victim to accident or natural disaster. They had been systematically eliminated by their own spiritual leader and his inner circle of devoted followers, killed for what Hollister termed a prophetic betrayal that threatened the very foundation of his divine mission. The case files revealed that the first warnings came from Margaret Sinclair, a former member who had fled the compound in January 1954 with her 2 young children. Her statement to the Weber County Sheriff's Department, dated February 3, 1954, described increasingly erratic behavior from Hollister and growing paranoia among the community's leadership.
Sinclair reported that Hollister had begun claiming direct communication with divine entities who warned him of traitors within the covenant. She described late-night tribunals where members were subjected to intense psychological interrogation, forced confessions, and what she termed spiritual purification rituals that involved physical and emotional abuse. Detective Brennan's notes, written in careful longhand across yellowing pages, indicate that Sinclair's initial report was filed but never investigated. The responding deputy, Thomas McKinnon, noted that Sinclair appeared emotionally unstable and suggested her claims were likely the result of feminine hysteria following a difficult separation from her religious community. McKinnon's dismissive attitude would later be revealed as part of a broader pattern of institutional indifference that allowed the tragedy to unfold without intervention. Before we continue with what happened next in that remote compound, if you're finding this case as compelling as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Cases like this deserve to be heard, and your support helps us continue uncovering these hidden stories that powerful forces once tried to bury forever. Now, back to Weber County, Utah, in the harsh winter of 1954. The Millfield area in 1954 represented a unique intersection of old and new America. Located 30 miles northeast of Salt Lake City, the region had been settled primarily by Mormon pioneers in the 1860s, families who had followed Brigham Young's vision of creating a religious utopia in the Mountain West. By the 1950s, however, the isolation that had once protected these communities was rapidly disappearing. The construction of new highways connecting rural areas to growing urban centers meant that traditional ways of life were under pressure from modernization and outside influence. Weber County itself was experiencing significant demographic and economic changes in the post-war period. The nearby Hill Air Force Base, established during World War II, had brought thousands of military personnel and their families to the region, creating a cultural tension between the area's traditional religious conservatism and the more secular influences of military life. Local newspapers from the period describe ongoing conflicts over issues ranging from Sunday business operations to the sale of alcohol, reflecting a community struggling to define its identity in a rapidly changing world. The landscape surrounding the Hollister Covenant was harsh and unforgiving, characterized by rolling hills covered in sagebrush and scrub oak, cut through by seasonal streams that turned the red clay soil into impassable mud during spring thaws.
Winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero, and the isolation of the compound meant that residents could go weeks without contact with the outside world when snow blocked the single dirt road that connected their property to the main highway. This geographic isolation would prove crucial to understanding how the events of March 1954 could unfold without immediate detection or intervention. The compound itself consisted of a main meeting hall constructed from local timber and stone, surrounded by smaller family dwellings that housed the 43 men, women, and children who called the Hollister Covenant home. Aerial photographs taken by the Utah State Police in April 1954 show a carefully planned community with vegetable gardens, livestock pens, and workshops arranged around a central courtyard where daily gatherings were held. The architecture reflected Hollister's vision of biblical simplicity, with buildings designed to echo the communal structures described in the Book of Acts, where early Christians were said to have held all property in common and lived according to divine guidance. The economic foundation of the covenant was based on a combination of subsistence farming, craft production, and financial contributions from members who had sold their worldly possessions upon joining the community. Financial records recovered during the investigation reveal that Hollister maintained strict control over all monetary resources, requiring members to turn over savings, property deeds, and even personal belongings to the communal treasury. This economic dependence created a powerful mechanism of social control, as leaving the covenant meant abandoning not just one's spiritual family, but also any hope of financial security in the outside world. The social structure within the covenant reflected Hollister's interpretation of biblical hierarchy and divine revelation. Adult males were organized into a council of elders responsible for making decisions about daily operations, while women were assigned to domestic duties and child-rearing responsibilities. Children over the age of 12 were separated from their parents and housed in communal dormitories where they received religious education and performed manual labor according to their abilities. This separation of families was justified by Hollister's teaching that biological relationships were less important than spiritual bonds forged through shared faith and divine purpose. Daily life within the covenant followed a rigid schedule of prayer, work, and religious instruction. Members rose before dawn for morning devotions led by Hollister himself, followed by a simple breakfast of bread, milk, and seasonal vegetables from the community gardens. The morning hours were devoted to manual labor, with men working in the fields or maintaining buildings, while women prepared meals, tended livestock, and educated younger children.
Afternoon sessions focused on religious study, with Hollister delivering lengthy sermons that interpreted current events through the lens of biblical prophecy and divine revelation. The evening meal was followed by what members called testimony meetings, where individuals were expected to share personal revelations, confess spiritual struggles, and demonstrate their commitment to the covenant's principles. These sessions often lasted well into the night, with Hollister using the opportunity to identify members who might be wavering in their faith or questioning his authority. Former members who later spoke with investigators described these meetings as psychologically intense experiences that combined elements of group therapy, religious confession, and public humiliation. The broader cultural context of 1950s Utah was crucial to understanding how the Hollister Covenant could operate with minimal outside scrutiny. The state's dominant religious culture emphasized respect for ecclesiastical authority and suspicion of government interference in religious matters. Local law enforcement officers, many of whom were themselves members of the LDS Church, were reluctant to investigate complaints about religious communities unless clear evidence of criminal activity was present. This cultural deference to religious authority created a protective bubble around groups like the Hollister Covenant, allowing them to operate according to their own rules with little fear of outside intervention. The post-war period also saw the emergence of numerous small religious movements throughout the American West, as individuals seeking spiritual meaning in an increasingly secular world gravitated toward charismatic leaders who promised direct access to divine truth. The Hollister Covenant was part of a broader phenomenon that included everything from UFO cults in California to fundamentalist Mormon splinter groups in Arizona and Utah. Law enforcement agencies lacked the training and resources to distinguish between legitimate religious expression and potentially dangerous extremism, often choosing to ignore concerning reports rather than risk accusations of religious persecution. Ezekiel Hollister himself was a figure whose personal history revealed the complex psychological and social forces that could transform a promising young seminarian into the architect of a devastating tragedy. Born in 1919 to a prominent Salt Lake City family with deep roots in Utah's Mormon establishment, Hollister had shown early promise as a religious scholar and community leader. His grandfather, Samuel Hollister, had been among the early investors in the Kennecott copper mine and had used his considerable wealth to support various religious and educational institutions throughout the territory. Ezekiel's childhood was marked by both privilege and profound spiritual searching.
Family letters preserved in the state archives describe a young man who was deeply troubled by what he saw as the increasing materialism and worldliness of modern religious practice. As a teenager, he had experienced what he described as direct revelations from divine sources, visions that convinced him that mainstream Christianity had strayed from its original purpose and that God was calling him to restore pure biblical faith to a corrupted world. His academic career at Brigham Young University had been distinguished but controversial. Professors remembered him as brilliant but increasingly isolated, a student who challenged orthodox interpretations of Scripture and claimed access to spiritual insights that went beyond traditional theological study. His senior thesis, titled The Restoration of Primitive Christianity in the Last Days, argued that existing religious institutions had become corrupted by human ambition and that true believers needed to separate themselves from worldly influence to prepare for the second coming of Christ. The psychological profile developed by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case files in 1984, suggests that Hollister displayed classic characteristics of narcissistic personality disorder, combined with what would now be recognized as religious delusions of grandeur. His ability to attract and maintain followers stemmed from a charismatic personality that combined genuine theological knowledge with an intuitive understanding of human psychological needs. He possessed what Martinez described as an uncanny ability to identify and exploit the spiritual vulnerabilities of individuals seeking meaning and purpose in their lives. The early years of the Covenant had been marked by genuine spiritual fervor and communal success. Members spoke of finding peace and purpose in their simple lifestyle, and several families reported that their children thrived in the structured environment of communal education and shared responsibility. Hollister's teachings during this period emphasized love, service, and preparation for divine judgment, themes that resonated with individuals seeking escape from the materialism and moral confusion of post-war American society. However, investigative documents reveal that Hollister's personality began to change significantly around 1952, following what he described as a series of profound revelations about the approaching end times. Former members reported that his sermons became increasingly focused on themes of persecution, betrayal, and the need for absolute loyalty to divine authority. He began claiming that God had revealed to him the names of specific individuals who would betray the covenant, and that harsh measures would be necessary to preserve the spiritual purity of the community. The transformation was also reflected in Hollister's personal relationships within the covenant.
Where he had once encouraged open discussion and democratic decision-making among the Council of Elders, he increasingly demanded unquestioning obedience to his interpretation of divine will. Members who raised concerns about his new directives were subjected to public criticism and spiritual counseling designed to break down their resistance to his authority. Of particular significance was Hollister's relationship with his inner circle of devoted followers, a group that included his wife, Sarah, his brother-in-law, Marcus Webb, and 3 other families who had been among the original founders of the Covenant. This inner circle, which Hollister referred to as the Chosen, was granted special privileges and responsibilities within the community, including access to private revelations that were not shared with ordinary members. It was this group that would ultimately participate in the events of March 1954, acting as both judge and executioner in what they believed to be a divinely mandated purification of their spiritual family. Sarah Hollister, born Sarah Catherine Morrison in 1923, had met her future husband during their shared time at Brigham Young University, where she had been studying elementary education with hopes of becoming a teacher. Family photographs from the period show a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, someone who projected an aura of quiet intelligence and deep spiritual conviction. Her transformation from idealistic college student to devoted follower of her husband's increasingly extreme religious vision represents one of the most tragic aspects of the entire case. Letters recovered from Sarah's personal effects reveal a woman who had initially questioned some of her husband's more radical interpretations of Scripture, but who gradually surrendered her independent judgment in favor of what she came to see as submission to divine authority, as channeled through her husband. Her writings from the final months before the tragedy show someone who had become completely convinced that the survival of their spiritual community depended on absolute obedience to Ezekiel's revelations, even when those revelations demanded actions that conflicted with her natural compassion and moral instincts. Marcus Webb represented another crucial figure in the Covenant's inner circle, a man whose military background and practical skills made him indispensable to the community's daily operations. A veteran of the Pacific Theater in World War II, Webb had returned from combat with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were poorly understood in the 1940s and 1950s. His sister's marriage to Hollister had provided him with a sense of purpose and belonging that he had been unable to find in civilian life, and his loyalty to the Covenant's leader was absolute and unquestioning.
Webb's military experience had made him responsible for security matters within the Covenant, including the maintenance of weapons used for hunting and protection against wild animals. Investigation records show that in the months leading up to the March tragedy, Webb had significantly expanded the community's arsenal, acquiring additional rifles and ammunition through legal purchases in nearby towns. When questioned about these acquisitions, Webb had explained that Hollister had received revelations about coming persecution from outside forces, and that the Covenant needed to be prepared to defend itself against hostile government agents and apostate former members. The 12 individuals who would ultimately lose their lives during those 3 days in March represented a cross-section of the Covenant's membership, ranging in age from 16 to 58, and including both long-time residents and more recent arrivals to the community. What united them, according to Hollister's increasingly paranoid worldview, was their supposed participation in what he termed the Great Betrayal, a conspiracy to undermine his authority and destroy the spiritual purity of the Covenant from within. The seeds of this perceived betrayal had been planted during the harsh winter of 1953-1954, when food shortages and mechanical failures had created significant hardships for the isolated community. Several members had quietly suggested that perhaps the Covenant should seek assistance from outside agencies or consider relocating to a more hospitable environment. These practical concerns were interpreted by Hollister as evidence of wavering faith and spiritual corruption, proof that certain members had allowed worldly influences to compromise their commitment to divine purpose. Among the condemned was Robert Patterson, a 42-year-old former accountant who had joined the Covenant in 1951 with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children. Patterson's financial expertise had made him valuable to the community's operations, but his occasional suggestions about more efficient resource management had been interpreted by Hollister as evidence of materialistic thinking incompatible with spiritual principles. His wife Eleanor, a gentle woman who had devoted herself to teaching the community's children, was included in the condemnation simply by virtue of her marriage to a suspected traitor. The youngest victim was Michael Harrison, a 16-year-old boy whose only apparent crime was asking too many questions during religious instruction sessions. Michael's intellectual curiosity and occasional challenges to literal interpretations of Scripture had marked him as a potential source of spiritual contamination, someone whose doubts might spread to other young people within the community. His parents, longtime Covenant members who had never expressed any disloyalty to Hollister's leadership, were forced to watch helplessly as their son was marked for elimination. As winter gradually gave way to early spring in 1954, the psychological pressure within the Covenant reached a critical breaking point. Hollister's sermons became increasingly focused on themes of purification and judgment, with lengthy discussions of biblical passages describing God's command to the Israelites to eliminate enemies from their midst. Members reported that the atmosphere within the compound became oppressive and fearful, with individuals afraid to speak openly about their concerns, lest they too be marked as traitors requiring divine correction. The final catalyst came during the first week of March, when Hollister announced that he had received the most significant revelation of his prophetic career. According to witnesses who survived the subsequent events, Hollister claimed that God had shown him a vision of the Covenant's future that could only be secured through the removal of corrupting influences within their spiritual family. The 12 individuals who had been identified as traitors would need to be returned to their Creator in order to preserve the salvation of the remaining faithful members.
What happened next would forever change the lives of everyone who witnessed it, creating trauma that would echo through generations and establishing a pattern of institutional silence that would keep the truth hidden for 30 years. The morning of March 12, 1954, dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and the first hints of spring visible in the budding trees that surrounded the Covenant's wooden buildings. The condemned members were awakened before dawn and told that they had been selected for a special spiritual ceremony that would cleanse them of their sins and prepare them for eternal judgment. They were led to the main meeting hall, where Hollister and his inner circle had prepared what they described as an altar of purification. The details of what followed would haunt the surviving witnesses for the rest of their lives, creating psychological scars that no amount of time or therapy could fully heal. As the sun rose over the Weber County foothills that morning, casting long shadows across the Covenant's courtyard, none of the remaining members could have imagined that they were about to witness the beginning of 3 days that would test every belief they held about faith, loyalty, and the nature of divine authority itself. The morning air carried an unusual stillness as Elder Matthias gathered the remaining Covenant members in the main assembly hall. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he opened the leather-bound journal that had belonged to Prophet Hollister, its pages yellowed with age and marked with cryptic annotations. The 43 survivors sat in perfect silence, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and desperate hope that somehow their leader's final words might provide clarity to the chaos that had engulfed their community.
Brothers and sisters, Matthias began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent in service to what he believed was divine truth. Our beloved prophet left us specific instructions for these dark times. He foresaw the trials that would come, the testing of our faith that would separate the wheat from the chaff. The elderly man's eyes swept across the assembled faces, searching for any sign of doubt or rebellion that might require immediate correction. In the third row, Sarah Jenkins clutched her young daughter's hand so tightly that the child whimpered softly. Sarah had been questioning the Covenant's increasingly strict interpretations of Scripture for months, but the events of the past few days had crystallized her fears into something approaching terror. She noticed how several of the male elders positioned themselves near the exits, their casual placement feeling anything but accidental. The journal's pages rustled as Matthias turned to a section marked with red ink. The prophet wrote extensively about the final purification that would be required before our ascension to the celestial kingdom. He understood that some among us would falter when faced with the ultimate test of faith. His voice grew stronger, more commanding, as he read from Hollister's increasingly erratic handwriting. Those who cannot surrender their earthly attachments, who cling to the false morality of the outside world, must be helped to find their way to redemption through divine correction. 24-year-old Michael Torres, who had grown up in the Covenant but secretly harbored dreams of attending college in Salt Lake City, felt his stomach tightened as he recognized the familiar pattern of escalating rhetoric that had preceded previous corrections. The community had witnessed several members subjected to increasingly severe punishments over the past year, justified as necessary steps toward spiritual purification. What had once seemed like harsh but well-intentioned discipline now took on a more sinister cast in light of recent events. Elder Bartholomew stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the front rows of the assembly. His reputation for enforcing the prophet's will had grown considerably since Hollister's passing, and many members had begun to fear his presence more than they respected it. "The time for half measures and gentle guidance has passed," he announced, his deep voice resonating through the hall. "We have identified 12 individuals whose spiritual contamination threatens the purity of our entire community." The names that followed sent shockwaves through the assembled believers. Among those called forward were respected families who had been part of the Covenant for decades, individuals whose only apparent crime had been asking questions about the increasingly authoritarian direction of the community's leadership. Thomas Wheeler, a skilled carpenter who had built many of the Covenant structures with his own hands, stood slowly when his name was called, his face pale but determined. His wife Rebecca remained seated, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the implications of her husband's selection. Mary Henderson, the schoolteacher who had dared to suggest that the Covenant's children might benefit from learning about the world beyond their isolated community, walked to the front with her head held high.
Her quiet dignity in the face of what everyone understood to be a death sentence served as both an inspiration and a rebuke to those who remained silent in their seats. The other 10 individuals called forward represented a cross-section of the community, united only by their apparent willingness to question the absolute authority of the remaining elders. The process that followed would later be described by survivors as a grotesque parody of religious ceremony, combining elements of traditional Mormon ritual with increasingly bizarre innovations that reflected the Covenant's descent into fanaticism. The accused were required to confess their sins before the assembly, with Elder Bartholomew serving as both prosecutor and judge. Those who refused to acknowledge their supposed spiritual failings faced immediate physical correction, while those who complied were told that their cooperation had earned them the privilege of voluntary redemption. Dr. Margaret Foster, a trained nurse who had provided medical care for the community for over 15 years, attempted to use her position of respect to challenge the proceedings. "This is not what the prophet would have wanted," she declared, standing to address the assembly. "I treated Brother Hollister during his final illness, and his last words to me were about forgiveness and compassion, not judgment and punishment." Her courage in speaking out seemed to energize some of the other members, several of whom nodded in agreement or whispered words of support. But Elder Matthias was prepared for such resistance. From his robes, he produced a document bearing what appeared to be Prophet Hollister's signature, authorizing the cleansing of the covenant through blood atonement for those whose sins cannot be forgiven through conventional repentance. The authenticity of this document would later become a central focus of the legal proceedings, but in the charged atmosphere of that morning, it served to silence most dissent. The 12 condemned individuals were moved to a separate building that had once served as a workshop, its windows boarded up, and its single entrance guarded by the most loyal of the remaining elders. Inside, they were told to prepare themselves spiritually for what was described as their translation to a higher sphere of existence.
The euphemistic language could not disguise the reality of their situation, but several of the condemned seemed to find genuine comfort in the belief that their deaths would serve some greater spiritual purpose. Outside the workshop, the remaining covenant members were organized into groups responsible for different aspects of what the elders termed the final ceremony. Some were tasked with preparing a large bonfire that would supposedly purify the community after the ritual was completed. Others were assigned to document the proceedings, creating what Elder Bartholomew described as a permanent record of their faithfulness during this crucial test. The systematic nature of these preparations suggested a level of planning that went far beyond spontaneous religious fervor. As the afternoon wore on, several families attempted to leave the compound, only to discover that the gates had been locked and armed guards posted at all potential exit points. The realization that they were essentially prisoners in their own community sent ripples of panic through the remaining members. Children began crying as they sensed their parents' fear, and the atmosphere of religious devotion gave way to something much darker and more desperate. The crisis reached its peak as the sun began to set on that terrible day. Elder Bartholomew emerged from the workshop carrying what appeared to be a ceremonial blade, its surface gleaming in the dying light. Behind him walked the 12 condemned individuals, their hands bound, but their faces showing a mixture of terror and resignation that would haunt the survivors for decades to come. The assembled community was forced to form a circle around a hastily constructed altar, their participation making them unwilling witnesses to what was about to unfold. What happened next was mercifully brief, but devastatingly thorough. One by one, the condemned individuals were brought forward, offered a final opportunity to confess their sins, and then subjected to what the elders described as blood atonement for the purification of their souls. The specific details of these executions were too traumatic for most witnesses to recall clearly, their minds apparently protecting them by blurring the memories of the most horrific moments. Thomas Wheeler was the first to die, his final words of prayer for his wife and children, rather than an expression of repentance for his supposed crimes. Mary Henderson maintained her dignity to the end, using her last moments to forgive her executioners and express hope that the children of the covenant would someday know a better world. Dr. Foster attempted to provide medical assistance to the other victims, even as she faced her own execution, her professional instincts overriding her personal terror. The psychological impact on the forced witnesses was immediate and profound. Several adults collapsed from shock,
while others began screaming or praying frantically for divine intervention that never came. Children who had been raised to believe in the absolute goodness of their religious leaders now watched those same leaders commit acts that contradicted everything they had been taught about morality and compassion. Elder Matthias attempted to maintain the religious framework of the proceedings by delivering lengthy sermons between each execution, explaining how the victims' deaths served to purify the entire community and bring them closer to their ultimate salvation. But his words rang increasingly hollow as the reality of what was happening became undeniable. By the time the 12th and final victim had been killed, even some of the most devoted believers were questioning everything they had once held sacred. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Several families barricaded themselves in their homes, terrified that they might be next on the list for purification. Others attempted to escape under cover of darkness, only to be turned back by the guards who now patrolled the compound's perimeter. The leadership's promises that the worst was over did little to calm fears that had been stoked beyond any reasonable limits. Sarah Jenkins made the decision that would ultimately save her daughter's life and her own. Using her knowledge of the compound's layout gained from years of living there, she managed to slip away during the confusion that followed the executions. With her daughter in her arms, she made her way through a drainage culvert that led beyond the compound's walls, emerging into the Utah wilderness as the first rays of dawn began to appear over the mountains. Her desperate journey to the nearest town took nearly 12 hours, during which she had to carry her exhausted child across rough terrain while fighting off her own physical and emotional collapse. When she finally stumbled into the sheriff's office in Ogden, her appearance and her story initially met with skepticism from law enforcement officers who found it difficult to believe that such atrocities could occur in their jurisdiction. Sheriff William Patterson was a veteran lawman who had seen his share of domestic violence and criminal behavior, but Sarah's account challenged his understanding of how far human beings could descend into depravity. Her detailed knowledge of the Covenant's leadership and her ability to describe the compound's layout convinced him that her story, however incredible, deserved immediate investigation. The first police response team arrived at the Covenant compound on the morning of October 15, 1954, expecting to find either a hoax or a situation that had been grossly exaggerated by a traumatized witness. Instead, they discovered a scene that would become one of the most documented crime scenes in Utah history, its horror preserved in police photographs and forensic reports that remain sealed to this day.
The 12 bodies had been arranged in a precise circle around the makeshift altar, their positions suggesting that some ritualistic significance had been attached to their placement. The physical evidence of the executions was overwhelming, but what struck the investigating officers most forcefully was the eerie silence that had settled over the compound. The remaining Covenant members sat in their homes like statues, many of them apparently catatonic from the trauma of what they had witnessed. Detective Raymond Kowalski, who had been brought in from Salt Lake City to lead the investigation, later described the scene as like walking into a graveyard where the dead were still breathing. The psychological damage inflicted on the survivors was so severe that many of them were unable to provide coherent statements for weeks after their rescue. Children who had been present during the executions showed signs of severe trauma, including selective muteness and night terrors that persisted for months. The forensic investigation revealed a level of premeditation that contradicted the leadership's claims of divine inspiration. Hidden in Elder Bartholomew's quarters, investigators found detailed plans for the executions, including diagrams of the altar's construction and lists of potential victims that went far beyond the 12 who had actually been killed. Most disturbing was the discovery of additional documents suggesting that the October killings were intended as merely the first phase of a larger purification that would have eventually claimed most of the Covenant's membership. The medical examiner's reports, conducted by Dr. James Morganson from the University of Utah, provided clinical confirmation of what the survivors had described. Each victim had been killed in a manner consistent with ritualistic execution, their deaths prolonged in ways that suggested the killers had been more concerned with ceremonial requirements than with minimizing suffering. The physical evidence also revealed that several victims had defensive wounds, indicating that they had attempted to resist their fate despite their apparent acceptance during the final ceremony. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a primitive recording device that had been used to document the proceedings. The audio quality was poor, but investigators were able to extract enough material to confirm the survivors' accounts of the religious rhetoric that had accompanied the killings. Elder Matthias's voice could be heard clearly as he delivered what he called the final show that the Covenant's leadership had been liquidating assets and preparing for what they termed relocation to a higher plane of existence.
Bank accounts had been emptied, property deeds had been transferred to shell organizations, and arrangements had been made for the disposal of what they euphemistically referred to as earthly remnants.
Federal authorities became involved when investigators discovered that the Covenant had been using the U.S. mail system to recruit new members from other states, making their crimes a matter of federal jurisdiction. FBI Special Agent Patricia Sullivan, one of the few female agents working complex criminal cases at the time, was assigned to coordinate the multi-jurisdictional investigation that followed. Agent Sullivan's background in psychology proved invaluable in understanding the group dynamics that had made such atrocities possible. Her interviews with the survivors revealed a pattern of gradual indoctrination and psychological manipulation that had prepared the community to accept increasingly extreme interpretations of religious doctrine. The process had been so gradual that many members had not recognized how far they had strayed from conventional morality until it was too late to resist. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered that Prophet Hollister's supposed final instructions had been forged by Elder Matthias in collaboration with Elder Bartholomew. Handwriting analysis conducted by experts from the FBI laboratory in Washington revealed that the documents authorizing the blood atonement ceremony had been created using samples of Hollister's signature taken from legitimate Covenant records. This revelation shattered the religious justification that had sustained many of the surviving Covenant members through the trauma of the executions. Several key witnesses who had previously been reluctant to cooperate with investigators suddenly became willing to provide detailed testimony about the events leading up to the killings. Their accounts painted a picture of a leadership that had become increasingly paranoid and power-hungry in the months following Hollister's death. The arrest began on November 3, 1954, exactly 3 weeks after the discovery of the crime scene. Elder Bartholomew was taken into custody at a motel in Nevada, where he had been hiding under an assumed name, his capture facilitated by a tip from a former Covenant member who had recognized his photograph and newspaper. Elder Matthias proved more elusive, having apparently fled to Mexico with a substantial amount of cash that had been embezzled from the Covenant's treasury. The legal proceedings that followed would establish several important precedents in the prosecution of religiously motivated crimes. District Attorney Robert Hayes, who had been elected on a platform of cleaning up corruption in Weber County, recognized that the case represented both an opportunity and a challenge that could define his career. The opportunity lay in prosecuting what was clearly a heinous crime that had shocked the entire state.
The challenge was in doing so without appearing to attack religious freedom itself. The prosecution's strategy focused on demonstrating that the defendant's actions had nothing to do with legitimate religious practice and everything to do with criminal conspiracy and premeditated murder. Hayes assembled a team of expert witnesses, including theologians, psychologists, and forensic specialists, who could explain to a jury how the Covenant's practices had diverged from accepted religious norms. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a professor of comparative religion at Brigham Young University, provided crucial testimony about the differences between mainstream Mormon doctrine and the increasingly deviant beliefs that had taken hold within the Covenant. Her scholarly analysis helped the jury understand that the defendant's claims of religious motivation were essentially fraudulent, designed to provide cover for criminal behavior rather than to express genuine spiritual conviction. The defense team, led by prominent Salt Lake City attorney Marcus Fitzgerald, faced the nearly impossible task of defending clients whose actions were clearly indefensible. Their strategy relied heavily on claims of diminished capacity, arguing that their clients had been so thoroughly indoctrinated by Prophet Hollister's teachings that they were unable to distinguish between right and wrong at the time of the killings. This approach required the defense to walk a fine line between acknowledging the horror of the crimes while maintaining that their clients were victims rather than perpetrators. Fitzgerald brought in his own team of psychological experts who testified about the effects of prolonged exposure to cult-like indoctrination, arguing that the defendants had essentially been brainwashed into believing that murder was a religious duty. The trial began on February 14, 1955, in the Weber County Courthouse, an imposing brick building that had served the community for over 40 years. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case since the initial arrests. Security was unusually tight, with sheriff's deputies stationed throughout the building and metal detectors installed at all entrances. Judge Harold Morrison, who had been assigned to the case despite having no prior experience with crimes of this magnitude, struggled to maintain order as emotions ran high among both spectators and participants. The graphic nature of the evidence presented challenges for everyone involved, from the court reporter who had to transcribe detailed descriptions of the executions to the jury members who were required to view crime scene photographs that few people should ever have to see. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming.
Witness after witness took the stand to describe the systematic planning that had preceded the killings, the manipulation of religious doctrine to justify murder, and the callous disregard for human life that had characterized the defendant's actions. Sarah Jenkins's testimony was particularly powerful, her quiet dignity and obvious trauma serving as a stark reminder of the human cost of the defendant's crimes. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Elder Ma finally apprehended in Mexico and extradited to face charges. His appearance in the courtroom after months on the run shocked observers who remembered him as a dignified religious leader. The man who shuffled into the defendant's chair bore little resemblance to the confident elder who had once commanded the respect of his community. His hair had gone completely white, his face was gaunt from poor nutrition and stress, and his eyes held a haunted quality that suggested he had finally begun to comprehend the magnitude of his crimes. The defense's presentation of their case proved to be a study in futility. Despite the expertise of their psychological witnesses and the sympathy that some observers felt for individuals who appeared to have been manipulated by a charismatic but dangerous leader, the evidence of premeditation and deliberate planning was simply too strong to overcome. The forged documents, the financial preparations, and the systematic nature of the killings all pointed to a conspiracy that went far beyond religious delusion. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The speed of their decision reflected not only the strength of the prosecution's case, but also the community's desire to see justice done for crimes that had shaken their fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil in their midst. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for the surviving victims to address the court and the defendants directly. Many of the Covenant's former members spoke about the ongoing psychological damage they had suffered, the nightmares that continue to plague them, and the difficulty of rebuilding their lives after having their faith in human decency so thoroughly shattered. Judge Morrison sentenced both Elder Bartholomew and Elder Matthias to death, a decision that was met with mixed reactions from the community. Some felt that execution was the only appropriate punishment for crimes so heinous, while others argued that life imprisonment would be more consistent with the Christian values that the defendants had claimed to represent. The sentences were automatically appealed, beginning a legal process that would continue for several more years. The appeals process revealed additional details about the case that had not been presented during the original trial.
Defense attorneys argued that their clients had not received adequate legal representation and that the intense media coverage had made a fair trial impossible. They also raised questions about the reliability of testimony from witnesses who had suffered severe psychological trauma, suggesting that their memories of events might have been distorted by the horror of what they had experienced. These arguments ultimately proved unsuccessful, but they did result in a more thorough examination of the evidence and the legal procedures that had been followed during the investigation and prosecution. The Utah Supreme Court's decision to uphold the convictions and sentences was unanimous, with the justices noting that the defendants had received more than adequate legal representation and that the evidence against them was overwhelming. The executions were carried out at the Utah State Prison on September 12, 1957, nearly 3 years after the original crimes. Both men declined to make final statements, though Elder Matthias did meet with a Mormon chaplain in his final hours and reportedly expressed remorse for his actions. The executions were conducted by firing squad, the traditional method used in Utah at the time, and were witnessed by a small group of officials and family members of the victims. The long-term impact of the Crimson Faith Massacre extended far beyond the immediate participants and their families. The case became a landmark in the legal treatment of religiously motivated crimes, establishing precedents that would be cited in similar cases for decades to come. Law enforcement agencies throughout the United States began developing specialized training programs for dealing with cult-like organizations and the unique challenges they presented. The surviving members of the Hollister Covenant faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives after having their entire worldview shattered by the events they had witnessed. Many sought counseling and therapy, though the limited understanding of trauma psychology in the 1950s meant that their recovery was often slow and incomplete. Some found solace in returning to mainstream religious practices, while others abandoned faith entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in divine goodness with the horrors they had experienced. Sarah Jenkins became something of a reluctant celebrity, speaking at conferences and meetings about the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of maintaining critical thinking even in the context of strong faith. Her daughter, who had been too young at the time of the massacre to understand what was happening, grew up to become a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, her career choice clearly influenced by her early experiences. The compound itself was eventually demolished, the land sold to developers who built a suburban housing subdivision on the site.
A small memorial plaque marks the location where 12 innocent people lost their lives, though few of the current residents are aware of the property's dark history. The plaque's simple inscription reads, "In memory of those who died for asking questions,"
May their sacrifice remind us that faith without compassion is not faith at all. The broader Mormon community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the potential for religious authority to be abused and the responsibility of religious institutions to prevent such abuses. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, while maintaining that the Hollister Covenant had long since departed from official Mormon doctrine, implemented new oversight procedures designed to identify and address extremist interpretations of church teachings before they could lead to violence. Academic studies of the case have continued for decades, with scholars from fields ranging from psychology to religious studies to criminology examining different aspects of how a community of believers could descend into such darkness. The case has been cited in hundreds of research papers and several books, each attempting to understand the complex interplay of factors that made the massacre possible. Dr. Amanda Foster, the daughter of Dr. Margaret Foster, who was killed in the massacre, dedicated her career to studying religious extremism and cult behavior. Her 1985 book, When Faith Becomes Fatal, remains one of the most comprehensive analyses of the psychological and social factors that contributed to the tragedy. In it, she writes, "My mother died believing that she was serving God, but she was actually serving men who had forgotten that the divine spark exists in every human being, not just in those who claim to speak for heaven." The case also had significant implications for how law enforcement agencies approach investigations involving religious communities. The initial skepticism that greeted Sarah Jenkins's account led to important changes in police training, emphasizing the need to take seriously reports of violence within religious groups, even when those reports seemed to contradict the community's public image. Federal agencies developed new protocols for monitoring groups that showed signs of increasing isolation and extremist rhetoric, though these efforts had to be balanced against constitutional protections for religious freedom. The challenge of identifying dangerous groups without infringing on legitimate religious practice remains a complex issue that law enforcement continues to grapple with today. The psychological trauma experienced by the survivors also contributed to advances in the understanding and treatment of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder.
Many of the Covenant's former members displayed symptoms that were not well understood by the medical community of the 1950s, leading to innovative treatment approaches that would later benefit other trauma survivors. The children who witnessed the massacre faced particular challenges in their recovery, as their developing minds struggled to process experiences that would have been difficult for adults to comprehend. Several of them required years of therapy and support before they could function normally in society, and some never fully recovered from the psychological damage they had suffered. The case has been referenced in numerous legal decisions involving religious freedom and the limits of protected religious practice. Courts have consistently held that religious belief, no matter how sincere, cannot justify criminal behavior, a principle that was clearly established in the prosecution of the Covenant's leaders. This precedent has been crucial in subsequent cases involving religiously motivated violence. The story of the Crimson Faith Massacre serves as a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for both transcendence and depravity, often existing within the same individuals and communities. The 12 victims died not because they lacked faith, but because they refused to abandon their moral compass, even when faced with claims of divine authority. Their courage in questioning what they knew to be wrong, even at the cost of their lives, stands as a testament to the power of individual conscience in the face of collective madness. The surviving records of the case, housed in the Utah State Archives, continue to attract researchers and journalists seeking to understand how ordinary people can be led to commit or tolerate extraordinary evil. The documents reveal a community that began with genuine spiritual aspirations, but gradually lost its way as power became concentrated in the hands of individuals who confused their own desires with divine will. Today, the Crimson Faith Massacre is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in Utah's history, a reminder that the quest for spiritual truth can become corrupted when it is divorced from basic human compassion and moral reasoning. The case challenges us to examine our own beliefs and institutions, to ask whether we are creating environments where questioning is welcomed or where dissent is silenced in the name of unity and faith. In the end, perhaps the most important question raised by this tragedy is not how such horrors could have occurred in a religious community, but whether we have learned enough from their example to prevent similar tragedies in our own time. When faced with claims of absolute authority, whether religious, political, or ideological, do we have the courage to ask the questions that might save lives, even when those questions challenge everything we have been taught to believe?